Hello, my dear friends. How are you? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. Welcome. I'm Arith Härger, and here I am today for another episode of the White Wand series. It's been a while, right? Now, let me just briefly take on 2 points before starting today's episode. Picking where we left off, sort of, on the case of the ancestors, right? I think it is important to mention something that may prove to be useful, hopefully, for those taking their first steps into working with the ancestors, especially when we are talking about a more pragmatic approach in traditional folk magic. And this might just as well be applied to other entities of all sorts. Sometimes there are a few mistakes along the way, but in the great majority of cases, I think it is preferable to see it as experimentations that give us lessons. As said before on other videos, including on an animistic approach to the ancestors, not all those who were once of our family line, bloodline, were good or even worthy to be remembered, let alone in some way recalled. Not everyone becomes an ancestor, in the sense of a worthy entity to be called upon and maintaining the memory alive. There's a very glamorous, even romantic idea of the ancestors which does not correspond to the reality of ancestor worship. When we take our first steps into such a craft, too often we forget to protect ourselves, protect the space we work at, and after the work is done, we forget to do banishing spells when it calls for it. Too often we do such performances at our home, in our room, at our safe and familiar space, some physical space we are often at. Let's say, when we open the ways to work with certain entities, including with the ancestors, sometimes it is left in the open an invitation for a variety of spirit entities with whom we have not created a relationship with in order to create a safe and respectful connection with them and for our craft and within our craft. What often may happen is that such entities linger on in such spaces due to the lack of protection or forgetting to do some banishing. It happens to many, even those who have been at this for quite some time. The point here is that, as an advice from me to you, since working with spirit entities can leave the door open to others, including ancestors in the sense of past family members that were not so good and whose traumas lead them to cling on to you and bring a lot of hardships you may not be ready to deal with, and indeed it's not even your position to deal with that. It's always preferable to do such work on spaces you don't go to that often, or indeed you rarely go to. This for your own safety if you are not yet familiar with protective and banishing spells or familiar with the processes to help certain ancestors to carry on with their cycle and eventually depart. For a witch, there's also a considerable amount of work towards the community, whatever community that may be. Sometimes such a person sees itself on a threshold, having to work with somebody else's ancestors or try to work through spirit entities attached to, let's say, a client, which the client wants to get themselves rid of. People seek help, and sometimes the witch's eagerness to help may lead down some roads the witch is not yet ready to walk. When dealing with such things, especially entities the person has not created a beneficial relationship of mutual respect, it's always good to do such work away from familiar spaces, away from spaces we live at and where we conduct our lives. Unless, of course, you already know how to protect yourself and conduct things in a way to avoid your familiar space from getting haunted and avoiding spirit entities and powerful energies to cling on and get stuck and disrupt your space and your life and the life of those with whom you share space with. So that's just an advice, right? Also, the other brief point is just a reminder that it is very important to work on ourselves in the sense of understanding what troubles us, our deep traumas, the things we have passed through that lead us to have certain behaviors and certain mind constructions that often places us in a stagnant position, and it feels like we are unable to move and to move on and properly perform our craft, properly develop our work and spirituality, right? So it's important to work on our physical and psychological health, as it also helps us to work on our spiritual health. The importance of knowing ourselves and working on our traumas and to understand our mental conditions is of the utmost importance in the development of our craft, or rather, in the development of our abilities, our gifts, that which we can call our medicine. When we find our medicine, from there, we can develop our gifts and express them to the community. In such cases, we are dealing with, in this series, obviously, spiritual work is a type of medicine, right? The spirit also needs medicine. Our spirit and the spirits of others who may seek our help or towards whom we feel the necessity to gift help. We work on ourselves, we find our own medicine, we find the gifts, the abilities that are more suitable to us and through which we develop our craft and ourselves, and such medicine can be given to others. We administrate the proper medicine we have found within ourselves. So remember that, right? Now, my dear friends, let's get started, if you please, and obviously, thank you very much for your time. So speaking of time, let us start from there. I've spoken here before of different perceptive realities and how that affects our condition and the way we interact with others, especially concerning the interactions we have with spirit entities that may come to be of aid in our craft. Now, time is a perceptive reality that, to a certain extent, can be altered. However, time is very much a reality of our modern human society. It is also a strong reality of our existence, of our mortality. But we, as entities with a denser form, we are subject to time and how it affects our perception. The denser the form, the more impact time has on our existence, and by consequence on our perception. Now, when reading past accounts about witchcraft, folklore, and other ways human persons interacted with the spiritual and the supernatural, I think we have all come to the realization that somehow it seems that our ancestors, and to our ancestors, such practices and interactions and experiences were far more vivid, far more real, and quite intense, to the point of creating several accounts, obviously outside the ones, the so often adulterated accounts of witch trials composed out of fear and agony. So accounts that give us a far more active interaction with the spirit world, in which people give detailed accounts of their experiences, even on a physical level. So that sort of information also lies deep in folklore, which we shall get to further ahead. But there's a very extensive network of information concerning people's interactions with the supernatural and their experiences that even left visible marks on the human perceptive reality and on the landscape itself. So, why was it so vivid for them and not as much for us nowadays? Well, there's certainly many answers for that, or rather, many factors, such as our religious upbringing, change in the modes of life, economic background, religious and political indoctrination, societal standards, several types of information, science, a variety of things. However, time is one of these huge factors that has led us to have less vivid experiences on a spiritual level, especially concerning our interaction with persons we so often call spirit entities. We come to a point in history when accounts concerning spirituality and the supernatural become less vivid than before, and yet people's reports on such subjects seem to be far more elaborated and yet far more delusional and don't flow as natural as before, which seems to be an attempt to fervently legitimize the experiences by the approval of the global community. And this happens precisely on a post-industrial economy. We have built for ourselves a type of life which requires much of our breathing time. We have schedules. We run our life not according to our natural needs as living persons of this world, but according to the stipulated time of our work. We run our lives through our working hours. We have divided time according to the time that is required of us to work on a post-industrial society. We put work first, and then everything else has to fall under the working schedule. We live by the hours we spend working, and only after work we get to live a little, and that short period of life outside work is often regulated by the next working hours and the things that we need to do in order to prepare ourselves for another day's work. Sadly, I'm not here to offer you an escape from that. It is not an easy task, and most people do not have the privilege to escape from it, as there are many different realities for each individual and for their family nucleus as well, which simply doesn't allow people to have a life that does not depend on post-industrial working time. But the fact is that this has robbed us of the time we used to spend observing nature and its cycles and the behaviors of other than human persons. If we look into pre-industrial agrarian societies, as an example, we find a lot of folklore, myths, and animistic belief systems that run around the cyclical moments of production based on land economy, planting and harvesting. Everything in a person's life in those periods and activities, in one way or another, will revolve around a perception of time that seems much longer than the one we currently have, and highly based on the seasonal cycles and phases of the moon even. The accounts concerning the supernatural and the spiritual are often in the moments of privacy or in moments outside the working period, usually within the domestic environment, in longer moments of rest, in moments when there's more time for observance and for thought and for interaction with everything else that lies outside work, which in an agrarian society is in close proximity with the natural world, since the natural world obviously has a great impact on an agrarian-based economy. This changes the perception of time and by extent the perceptive reality as a whole. You do not live by the hour with short periods of rest, but by the season with longer periods of rest. Instead of a focus on every passing minute and every passing hour, eager for the job to end, in a pre-industrial agrarian society, people lived by the season, in which the perception of time gives the sensation that life, for a human being, seems to be far longer, as the focus is on the season of plantation and harvesting. Now, as another example, looking further back into pre-industrial and non-agrarian societies, in, let's say, in a hunting-gathering type of society, and in nomadic societies living off the land, the perception of time is much longer, as it was or is based on the passing of the main seasons and the existence of sun and moon, light and darkness, daytime and nighttime. Life is not lived by the hour, life is not lived by the months of harvest and the months of respite of the soils, but there is instead a longer perception of time, as the human focuses much more on natural changes that have a greater visual impact, such as the day and the night, but also the weather changes that comes with the yearly seasons. Much of folklore and mythology, which are important cultural codes, are not just reflections of human trauma, but also, in great part, the human interaction towards landscape, the formation of the human cognitive landscape through land connectedness. And it's no coincidence that the great majority of folklore tradition that has had a greater impact on our current lives and upbringing in relation to culture, at least as an example for the case of Europe, was created between the 17th and 19th centuries, in periods of great change concerning the European mind towards landscape, due to how the landscape drastically changed with industrialization and massive modes of production and harvesting resources, which by consequence changed the perception of time and perception of the human being within the landscape, breaking land connectedness, leading to types of folklore that deal a lot more with trauma and the more negative and even dangerous perception of nature and its spirit entities. The progressive detachment from nature due to industrialization and its destruction, and the progressive focus on urban life and the hours of the working life, led many of us to have a shorter attention span, a lot less focused on observation of life, nature and its cycles, and the disengagement from our presence and existence within nature. This led us to shift the attention to other things concerning the working time on a post-industrial society, and few moments, if any at all, to observe what surrounds us in the natural world. As such, there has been little time, if any at all, to create time and space to deal with spirit entities and create relationships with them. Just the same way, there's little time to observe the behavior of animals and getting used to their presence and them with ours. Let's try to paint a mind image here. The more time we get to observe the behavior of a fox, the better we will get to know about its life, the ways of communication of the fox, what it feeds on, where it dwells, where it goes, the interactions it has with others, and progressively getting used to our presence and we with theirs. A relationship can be created between us and the fox, if enough time is given to observance. We gather knowledge and we find ways to interact. Ways of interaction that can result in a beneficial relationship, even if the aim is just companionship. With enough time, we can get the company of a fox, and by itself, it is a change in our life that can be much better than what we previously had, which was the absence of the fox. The inclusion of the fox in our life as a companion, in which there's a relationship of mutual respect and trust, and perhaps even something beneficial, changes both lives. There are new activities, new behaviors, new rituals, new ways of interaction, and new knowledge, new information. The same thing happens with spirit entities. Instead of the fox, we observe the behaviors of the natural world. We start to see change. We start to see patterns. We and them start to get used to each other's presence and behaviors and actions and interactions and modes of life. Our ancestors' stories and accounts and myths, folklore, and the very animistic belief systems towards their experiences with spirit entities were far more vivid and comprehensive due to time. The time to observe and interact, which leads to knowledge, and knowledge leads to experience. As I said many times before, witchcraft is an experimental activity, and we need time to experiment. We need time to take action, observe, and experiment to observe some more and gather more knowledge. Our interaction with spirit entities is through observance and experimentation that gives us experience. And that is only possible when we have time. So obviously, it has been very hard for us, or for many of us, at least nowadays, to conduct our craft within a society highly governed by working time, which robs us from land connectedness. Rewiring our brain to have a seemingly longer perception of time governed by the seasons and the day and the moon is of tremendous importance for a land connectedness, and by consequence for a longer observation of the persons that surround us and the creation of relationships with such persons, including other than human and more than human persons. So that's a difficult work, right? Made even more difficult by the attachment we have to the stipulated working time most of us need in order to survive. It will never be an easy task, but at least we know that we require time and we need to shift our time a lot more into observance of the natural cycles. From there, a few steps can be done, and perhaps future generations will have the opportunity to progressively have more time to spend in observance of the natural cycles and to shift our perception of time into longer periods of an existence tied to the land and its persons. All this to also tell you that a relationship with a spirit entity can be quite hard to accomplish if we do not have this perception of time, and if we do not have the perception of how our own perception of time affects the relationships with spirit entities, because their modes of life are not like ours and their perception of time is quite different. Some of whom have no perception of time at all. As I said, time is not just a reality of denser forms of life, but it is also a shifting reality to human societies who depend so much on time. We do need to have this mind process that helps us to understand that spirit entities do not perceive time as we do, especially entities with, let's say, lighter or less dense forms. Their perception of time isn't the same, and they may see you in a different way, obviously, but they may see you grow up to become an adult and passing through several moments of life until you yourself become a lighter form of existence. And to them, it is but a mere moment. Just as the same time, the lifespan of a fly seems short to us, but quite long for the fly itself, our own lifespan may indeed seem short in the perception of a spirit entity. It has to do with the perception of time, which is governed by a person's condition of existence, but also very much governed by all the factors of our life that force us to divide our existence into parts and fit them in periods of time more suitable to our current life in a given society. Our perception of time can be altered. Mind you, we cannot give more time to ourselves than the one that is naturally stipulated to our current form, but we can change the perception of time by the way we perceive and interact with the cycles of nature. Within traditional folk magic, perception of time is important not only to create relationships with spirit entities, but also to have the notion that spirit entities don't have the same perception of time like we do, and the same perception towards us like we have towards them. This helps us to better understand, as far as it is possible, of course, their own minds and intentions. Understandably, we are too hasty in our interactions with them, and more so in a post-industrial society, highly materialistic and governed by capitalism. So we need to slow down, especially our own mind, perceive time as much as possible under the flows of the cycles of nature. Slow down our minds and heart rate, slow down our spirits, and then better interact with spirit entities whose existence is much slower than almost everything we perceive in the reality of our denser forms. Speaking of time, we must speak of space as well. Taking on an animistic approach, which has always been very much a core perception of traditional folk magic, the interaction with spirit entities in the world is very much a visitation to their environment, as much as they visit you in your own space when relationships have been created, or at the very least, as spoken here before on other videos of this series, when you have caught their attention and interest. With the shift of perception of time and having time for observance or observation and visitation of spaces, we realize that certain spaces are quite powerful and for some reason have a great amount of spirit activity. This is not to say that we can only find spirits just in particular spaces, but rather there are places in the world that are quite powerful, which helps us to develop our abilities and create healthy and beneficial relationships through those powerful spaces. Locations in the world that have the potential to become passages between realities. Due to the fact that we have lost time to observe and experience, as well as losing particularly important pieces of knowledge that now mostly lie within folklore, it's quite hard to recognize such places. Some places might be more active than others, but it is still hard to look at the landscape and be aware of powerful locations that may aid in our craft, and even through such powerful spaces, create relationships with spirit entities, as well as to cross the hedge and become the other and navigate through a different perception. Powerful sites with spirit activity don't just spontaneously sprout from nothing. There has been a long process of active observance, experimentation, and experience in the creation of important relationships between human persons with other than human persons in specific sites, and such sites have become the in-between grounds for such relationships, which, with time, such spaces become more active because they were places of gathering to establish relationships. Many of these sites were gathering places for important yearly moments of change, where human communities celebrated cyclical changes by creating or re-establishing relationships with the land and its persons, particularly with the spirit entities whose beneficial relationship with human communities provided or helped to provide the right conditions for survival. Many of such places have been abandoned through time for a variety of reasons, but there's still some activity in them. Other places still have the same or similar functions for a variety of communities around the world, which, either through tradition or indeed due to the survival of ancestral rituals, remain quite active even to this day and are still powerful places of spirit activity. The point here is that through a continuous interaction between human communities and spirit entities, land connectedness is reinforced turning certain places into sacred spaces. So let me give you a brief and general example. As a former archaeologist for 11 years, as some of you know, when working on Neolithic sites and a focus on the megalithic monuments, there's an interesting pattern, which are the alignments of the monuments in terms of the landscape. So much so that, as a curiosity, in my first year, I had a professor who was lecturing us for the first time, actually, and she had just come up with an interesting discovery. By herself, still as a student, she went into the wilderness and simply observed the landscape. There was nothing visible in terms of human structures. Yet, according to the observance of megalithic structures, we do find patterns in the landscape. And so she looked into the landscape and thought about a good place to place a megalithic monument, to construct a megalithic monument. She thought, where would our ancestors place a megalithic monument here, right? Which spot would be the most appropriate? She saw the patterns and looked into a specific spot and thought, there, that's a good place. So she went to the landscape, started to dig on that spot, and indeed there was a megalithic monument buried there. So we see this pattern all over the world, not just from earlier periods, but still today. Many communities around the world still travel these lines in the landscape, which seem to be paths our human ancestors often took on some sort of religious pilgrimage, which draws these lines in the landscape, which represent our human ancestors' land connectedness. Among Australian Aboriginals, Native Americans, Eurasian Paleolithic sites, Polynesian landscape lines, European megalithic monuments, and among many African communities and groups as well, Christianized sites and religious traveling paths, etc. They all show very active traces of sort of pilgrim trails, right? Pilgrimage. These sites and activities show us ancestral land connectedness, landscape knowledge, powerful sites that print human relationship with the land, and by consequence, human relationship with other than human persons of the landscape, creating sites of spirit activity precisely due to the established relationships in the past between humans and land and its persons. These landscape lines and sites are the structure of mythology and landscape and ecological knowledge, as well as the core of stories and folklore about important human relationships with land and nature and its persons. As I said here many times before, mythology is a cultural code which encompasses quite a lot of information concerning animistic belief systems, as well as human perception and interaction towards landscape, the cognitive landscape. This knowledge of the contact with the land and these landscape lines and sacred sites is somewhat preserved in myths, albeit obviously certainly hard to decipher. But it is also preserved in folklore, which, like mythology, preserves culture, preserves tradition, preserves knowledge concerning human relationships with land, which helps us to try to reconnect with the land. They tell us stories which certainly underwent great changes through time and by the changes of social and religious structures, but in their core still lies powerful interactions and experiences of ancestral relationships with the landscape and spirit entities that were once important among human communities on a collective and individual level. Throughout history, we continue to see human interactions towards the landscape. Every time people either came into a new place or they continuously returned to places that were somewhat sacred to them as physical places that are or that contained or are contained in myths, stories, and folklore and all sorts of narratives. we continue to see, even nowadays, rituals, ceremonies, traditional festivities towards a particular landscape feature or space, and at those spaces as well. The rituals and ceremonies towards the landscape are animistic ceremonies to open land connectedness in order to be part of the place and create beneficial relationships with that place and its persons. Again, returning to an agrarian animistic perception as an example, if the basis of economy is the exploration of land resources, particularly through gathering and harvesting, important animistic ceremonies are created with the land in order to open land connectedness and to establish and or re-establish beneficial relationships with the spirit entities of the land, which aid the human communities in their survival and to continue on surviving and thriving. These particular celebrations are the animistic rituals towards landscape and its persons, which are the core of so many yearly celebrations we still celebrate today, which were structured in the agrarian calendar. But it's obviously not just a phenomenon of agrarian animism. We see these celebrations in many different cultures, in many different periods in each culture's history and traditions. It is this act of interacting with the landscape and creating relationships with it. These rituals, these ceremonies, aimed at creating a sense of belonging to the land and belonging to its existing communities of many persons, most of which non-human persons, that inhabit the landscape. When human communities enter these new landscape spaces, these animistic ceremonies helped to create a connection with the land and an introduction of the human community to the existing communities of the others and establishing beneficial relationships of mutual respect with the spirit entities of the land in order to consolidate the sense of belonging to the land. All of this is land connectedness. So all of this to tell you that because of our perception of time and loss of time for observance and experimentation to try to rebuild and re-establish land connectedness, there's also a loss in our perception of landscape and what spaces are more active concerning the spiritual. So my advice in this is that, fortunately, we can still look at the myths, the stories, the folklore for a few answers. The knowledge of the interaction between humans and spirits of the land still lie in the narratives that have somewhat survived through the generations in our oral traditions. And hopefully this also helps to understand why it is so important to preserve indigenous narratives, not only because without them people lose their sense of belonging because they lose land connectedness, and that problem should be obvious at this point nowadays, but also because we get a better perception of what surrounds us and the non-human persons that inhabit the land as such. By re-establishing land connectedness, our entire perception of life, meaning and purpose start to shift into something a lot more connected to the land itself, which gives us a sense of belonging, a sense of protection and understanding of our existence. And it is medicine for the spirit, which by consequence, it is medicine for the body and mind. So my advice to when it is hard to establish a connection with the land and its spirits, particularly establishing a relationship with spirits that may aid us in our craft, look into folklore at the very least. Be that the general folklore, cultural folklore, regional folklore, and also, very important, the local folklore of the places you are trying to establish a relationship with, establish a connection with. These narratives can become forms of finding meeting places between human persons and the others in particular spaces that were once at the center of human relationships with spirits and landscape. These relationships have created a connection with a site, and this particular site can be the hedge the witch may use to cross between realities in order to form beneficial relationships for the sake of the craft, that craft being the witch's medicine that develops through these relationships, which by extent can aid the community and the witch itself, obviously. And this to also say that when someone tells you that witchcraft can only be done by those who have a special gift, or it is only hereditary, things are not as simple or indeed as limited as that. It is indeed possible for a person to find its own medicine through land connectedness. And many gifts and abilities a person might have can indeed be developed through established relationships with spirit entities and landscape. Even if it were just a hereditary case, the person would stagnate in its abilities if there isn't the effort to create these spirit relationships, and the natural landscape itself is a wonderful place to start because it is at hand. We can walk into it, we can interact with it, we can develop our observance, and we can experiment. As I said, traditional folk magic, well, witchcraft, is a pragmatic route of an animistic perception. As such, experimentation on the spot through interaction with the land is fundamental in the development of traditional folk magic. The more you interact with powerful sites and create relationships with its persons, the more the ability to cross the hedge is developed. And ancestral traces of this land connectedness can still be found in the narratives, and folklore is a good place to start. As I said many times before, a well-read witch is a powerful witch. Speak with the land. Speaking with the land, it's not just with the land itself and its entities, but also the humans of the land, the people who are tied to the land, the humans and their ancestors who have created a sense of belonging with that land. Too often, people tend to discard the human factor in traditional folk magic and indeed overall in New Age religions and spiritualities as well. And perhaps this is due to a variety of individualistic sense of things which is fermented by our distorted perception of reality, which it is often believing that reality is solely an expression of our individual perception, which by itself is a perception that has been adulterated by many social, economic, political, and religious factors of our upbringing. There are as many perceptions of life as there are eyes and minds to see it. It's important to include other people's perception of things and their narratives, their knowledge, particularly their landscape knowledge. If the witch is to aid itself and aid its community, the witch must remember the human factor in itself and in its community. When the witch is able to cross the hedge, it becomes part of the communities of many persons, both human and non-human. Landscape knowledge is fundamental to find our medicine. And the best way to start is through the narratives that contain traces of that ancestral knowledge. But also talking with others, with other human persons, with the other, human persons who are in the possession of important narratives about land connectedness. That's what it is. So, my dear friends, I hope this episode was useful. We are just getting started. And indeed, this series, as you know, as I said before, contain knowledge and advice to take the first steps into traditional folk magic, even for those who have started a long time ago and due to, several unfortunate experiences, there may be trauma involved even, but there is an eagerness still to start anew from a safer point. But as I said many times before, witchcraft is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be liberating. However, and of course, we have to use our senses, be realistic, rational, and practical. There's always a way to minimize, as much as possible, the most harmful aspects of our engagement with life. My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.